Before he was the eye of Bamako, he was the eyes of the herd. Long before the flash bulbs popped in the sweaty nightclubs of the capital, Malick Sidibé knew the light. He was born into the Peul people, a lineage of nomads and pastoralists, in the small village of Saloba. His birth date was a mystery, a common fluidity in a time and place where the seasons mattered more than the calendar. But the era was the mid-1930s, when the map of West Africa was still colored in the administrative hues of the French Empire. As a child, his world was not defined by the borders of a photograph, but by the horizon of the Sahel. From the age of 5, he was a shepherd. This was his first apprenticeship in observation. To watch a herd of sheep or cattle requires a specific kind of vigilance. You must see the collective movement and the individual stray simultaneously. You must understand the language of shadows as the sun drags them across the red earth. You must notice the twitch of an ear, the shift in the wind, the texture of the grass. In the silence of the bush, Malick learned to see. He didn't just watch, he recorded, not with a camera, but with charcoal. The young shepherd was an artist of the dust. He would draw the animals he tended, capturing the curve of a horn or the heavy stance of a bull on the walls of the family compound. It was this talent, this uncanny ability to translate the three-dimensional world into a two-dimensional surface, that pulled him away from the herd. It was a talent that demanded the white school. Leaving the village was a fracture, a tearing away from the land, but Malick carried the shepherd's patience with him. At school, his draughtsmanship was undeniable. He didn't just draw what he saw, he drew the spirit of what he saw. He won prizes for his art, eventually finding his way to the school of the Sudanese craftsmen in Bamako to study jewelry making. There he learned to work with the minuscule, to appreciate the gleam of silver and gold, to understand that an accessory could transform a person. But the metal was cold, and Malick was drawn to something more fluid, the alchemy of light. Bamako in the 1950s was a city of two worlds. There was the colonial city, stiff and starched, and the African city, vibrant and waiting to exhale. Malick found himself bridging the gap when he was hired by a French photographer, a man known locally as Jeje la Pellicule, Jeje the film. Malick was not hired as a visionary, he was hired as a decorator, a shop assistant. But the curious jeweler soon found his way into the dark room. For anyone who has never stood in the red gloom of a developing room, it is difficult to explain the sorcery of it. You stand in the smell of acrid chemicals, fixer and stop bath, and you watch a blank piece of paper floating in a tray. Then, slowly, ghosts appear. A face, a tree, a smile rises from the white void. Malick fell in love with this magic, but he also noticed a disparity. Gigi was the photographer for the colonial elite. He photographed the official balls, the stiff diners, the Europeans in their high collars looking serious and important. Malick, however, began to photograph the others. He photographed the Africans. He realized quickly that the camera was often a weapon of the colonizer, a tool used to catalog, to study, and to exoticize the African subject. But in Malick's hands, the camera became something else. It became a mirror. He didn't want to capture natives for a postcard. He wanted to capture his friends, his neighbors, the people who were alive with a kind of energy the Europeans ignored. He bought his first camera, a simple Brownie flash. It was a humble box, but to Malick, It was a scepter. He began to cycle through the city, capturing the faces that the official histories were leaving out. He learned that while the Europeans wanted to look important, the Africans wanted to look beautiful. They wanted to look like themselves. In 1962, 2 years after Mali ripped itself free from colonial rule to become an independent nation, Malick opened his own space, Studio Malick. It was located in the heart of the Bagadaji neighborhood. To call it a business would be a misunderstanding of what Studio Malick actually was. It was a theater. It was a community center. It was a confession booth. The studio was small, open to the street, and perpetually hot. But inside, anything was possible. Malick understood that a portrait was not just a record of a face. It was a construction of a dream. He became a director. He gathered props like a treasure hunter, a shiny Vespa scooter, a transistor radio, a pair of dark sunglasses, a stripped background, a plastic flower. People didn't just come to get a photo taken. They came to be transformed. A mechanic would come in, grease under his fingernails, put on a fedora and a suit, lean against a motorcycle, and for the split second of the shutter click, he was a movie star. He was the hero of his own life. Malick's genius was his hospitality. He didn't rush. He drank tea with his subjects, he joked with them, he touched their shoulders, adjusted their collars, tilted their chins. He made them feel seen before he ever looked through the lens. He famously said that he wanted his pictures to be so alive that you could smell the perfume of the subject. And the youth came in droves. They came in bell-bottoms and miniskirts holding record covers of Jimi Hendrix and James Brown. They were the first generation of free Malians, and they were drunk on the possibility of the future. They didn't want to look traditional, they wanted to look modern, cosmopolitan, and cool. Malick gave them that permission. He didn't impose a style on them, he let them impose their style on the film. If the days belonged to the studio, the nights belonged to the rhythm. Bamako in the 1960s and 70s was a city that did not sleep. The air was thick of the sound of the twist, rock and roll, and Afro-Cuban rumba. This was the era of the surprise party. Gatherings organized by youth clubs with names like the Beatles or the Sputniks. Malick became the chronicler of these nights. He was the only photographer who could keep up. He would finish his work at the studio, hop on his bicycle, and later his motorbike, and ride into the darkness. He would visit 4, 5, sometimes 6 parties in a single night. He was not an intruder. He was an essential ingredient of the party. When Malick arrived, the energy spiked. "The photographer is here," the kids would shout. They would drag him to the center of the dance floor. This is where Malick's training as a shepherd returned. In the chaos of a dimly lit dance floor, amidst the swirling dust kicked up by frantic feet and the smoke of cigarettes, he had to anticipate the moment. He had to see the connection between a boy and a girl before they even touched. He shot from the hip. He shot from the floor. He captured the sweat, the blur of a skirt, the ecstatic throw of a head laughing at the ceiling. He used the flash not just to light the room, but to freeze the joy. His photos from this era are noisy. You can hear the music when you look at them. You can feel the heat. He wasn't interested in the perfect composition of a landscape. He was interested in the back view, the sight of a person walking away or dancing with their back to the camera. He found mystery in the turn of a shoulder. He understood that sometimes you see a person's soul more clearly when they are lost in the music than when they are staring at the lens. He would stay up until dawn, ride back to the studio, and develop the film immediately. By the next afternoon, the proofs were pinned to the outside of his studio door. The youth would flock to Bagadaji to find themselves in the pictures. "Look, there I am. Look how we danced." It was a social network made of paper and chemicals. Why did he do it? Why devote a life to parties and portraits? For Malick, it was a counter-narrative. He knew what the West thought of Africa. He knew the images that circulated in Europe and America, images of famine, of war, of suffering, of primitive life. He knew that the Western lens often stripped Africans of their dignity, reducing them to statistics or victims. Malick's rebellion was happiness. His weapon was the smile. He wanted to show the world that African youth were not just surviving, they were thriving. They were hip, they were sexy, they were joyful, and they were participating in the global conversation of culture. When a young man posed with the radio, he was signaling that he was tuned into the world. When a couple danced the twist, they were claiming their bodies for themselves. He didn't need to photograph politicians or soldiers to document history. He realized that the true history of a nation is found in how its people fall in love, how they dress for a Saturday night, and how they hold their hands. He captured a lightness of being that was, in itself, a political act. He often spoke of the importance of making the subject look good. This wasn't vanity, it was generosity. He believed that every human being possessed a natural beauty, and it was the photographer's moral duty to find it. If a subject had a scar, he would turn their face to the shadow. If they were short, he would shoot from below to make them look like a giant. He gave his subjects the gift of their best selves. As the decades rolled on, the frantic energy of the 60s settled, color photography arrived, then digital. The youth found new ways to document themselves, but Malick remained in Baghdadi. The world eventually caught up to him. In the 1990s and 2000s, the art world discovered Malick Sidibé. Curators from Paris and New York arrived at his small, dusty studio, stunned to find tens of thousands of negatives stored in simple boxes, a complete archive of a golden era. They gave him awards, the Golden Lion, the Hasselblad, honors usually reserved for the high priests of the fine arts, not a neighborhood studio photographer from Mali. But Malick remained Malick. He didn't move to a mansion in Europe. He stayed in the neighborhood. He became a father figure, the old lion. He would sit outside his studio, greeting passers-by, surrounded by broken cameras. In his later years, he became a repairman. People would bring him their broken devices, old film cameras that the digital world had forgotten. He would sit with his jeweler's tools, fixing the springs and shutters, breathing life back into the machines. It was a fitting role for a man who had spent a lifetime preserving moments that would have otherwise vanished. He joked about his fame. He found the Western obsession with his art amusing. To him, it had never been about art in the pretentious sense. It had been about work, about community, and about the simple transaction of making someone happy with a piece of paper. Malick Sidibé passed away in 2016, but in a very real sense, he never left the studio. Today, if you look at the history of the 20th century, you see wars, revolutions, and moon landings. But if you look through Malick's lens, you see something else. You see a young man in plaid pants leaning back with supreme confidence. You see two siblings holding hands, trying to look serious but failing. You see a girl in a patterned dress turning her back to the camera, looking out at a river, mysterious and eternal. He didn't just take photos. He preserved the spirit of a nation during its most hopeful hour. He proved that joy is as serious as tragedy, and that a smile caught in the flash of a bulb can outlive the empire that tried to erase it. The party in Baghdadi is over. The music has faded and the dancers have grown old or passed on. But in the black and white frames of Malick Sidibé, the night is still young, the music is still loud, and the future is still unwritten. Did he capture the happiest moments in history? Perhaps, or perhaps he simply reminded us that history is made of such moments, and that if we look closely enough, if we look with the eyes of a shepherd and the heart of a friend, we can see the light in everyone.